Assalamu alaikum. You're listening to Unity FM on 93.5. My name is Nasser Mahmood and this is the Friday Drive Show. Apologies, we haven't been having a regular drive show, but we're back now. And today we're talking to Dr. Chris Allen. At the end of this month, Dr. Chris Allen, Associate Professor at the University of Leicester, has a new book out titled Reconfiguring Islamophobia, a radical rethinking of a contested concept. The book tries to better understand why politicians and the public more generally still don't take Islamophobia seriously, despite the fact that Islamophobic hate crimes are known to be on the rise. Reflecting on his own experience of working with successive governments, he also draws on the experience of more than 100 victims of street-level Islamophobia to come to some radical and quite scathing conclusions. So it's been 10 years since your last book, Dr. Chris, on Islamophobia. Why do you feel the time was right for a new one?
Oh, first off, thanks for inviting me back.
It's good to be back on
Unity FM. Thanks so much. It's 10 years since my first book on Islamophobia, which at the time was, something that I felt was necessary to try and understand what we meant by the term and by the concept and so on. And this really was really about the next step. And over that 10-year period, I've been doing smaller research projects, working with Muslim communities, primarily in the West Midlands and Birmingham area, but also in London, in the East Midlands and elsewhere around the country, and beginning to engage people and talk to them about what their experiences has been. And I think one of the key things for me has been throughout that is this idea that people becoming, increasingly more fearful. People, Muslims who I engage, talk more openly about the experiences that they're encountering. Whether that's walking down the street, whether that's online, whether that's from their children or their family or their parents. These things become kind of part of everyday life, and and it affects the way people are living. And I guess that for me, when I was looking at the kind of wider picture, and in the last few years we see things like Punish a Muslim Day. We see the Conservative Party being charged with or being alleged to have kind of Islamophobic incidents occurring on a week by week basis. When we have our Prime Minister just a couple of years back back in the summer of 2017 referring to Muslim women as letterboxes and bank robbers. For me, it felt that the time was right to actually begin to try and pull this together, because I was seeing that there was lots of different things going on, and people were seeming to forget that actually what happens to those individuals, who are actually being spat at walking down the street, or having their hijabs pulled off their heads, or being told to go back to where they belong, and that for me was really the driver, because I just felt that the time was right, and it was time to really kind of challenge people and begin to kind of try and raise the issue of Islamophobia in a more meaningful way for us to try and move forward and really try and do something about it. So that was the motivation for the book, really, and why I felt now was the right time.
In the book, you draw on the experience of more than 100 victims of street-level Islamophobia, some of whom were from Birmingham and the West Midlands. What were some of your findings? Well,
I kind of looked at three different perspectives. So I looked at female victims, I looked at male victims, and then I looked at the kind of the kind of physical structures. So looking for that kind of lens of hate crime. I wanted to kind of try and get the full, to kind of look right across the way in which Islamophobia, kind of manifests itself in real ways, how it becomes tangible. And so I wanted to make sure that I included this stuff, whether that's graffiti on a mosque or so on, because, if somebody graffitis a mosque, actually the impact it has can be much wider than what it does if maybe you say something, verbally abuse an individual. Because everybody who identifies with that mosque, or everyone identifies as being Muslim, if they see something on the side of a mosque, actually that impacts them in a very negative and detrimental way. So I wanted to look across those kind of three perspectives. There's been a lot of research, or quite a bit of most of the research, the academic research that's been done, has been around kind of female victims. And so in many ways, my research kind of just reinforced what we already knew. We know that, if you're a visible Muslim woman if you wear the hijab or you wear the niqab.
A weaker member of society.
Yeah,
minority.
it's going to be, you are going to be, it's that kind of visible aspect which actually kind of prompts somebody who wants to perpetrate a hate crime, to kind of target you. So we know that was the thing. What became interesting in the research I did was that it's, from 10 years ago, it seemed to become much more mainstream, much more normalised. And so, before it would almost be that, Muslim women would be walking down the street on their own, or be kind of like somewhere where, there wasn't a lot of other Muslims around. Whereas now what I was finding was that, there was things like a lot of the kind of female victims were saying that they were attacked either on the way to taking their children to school, some were attacked on the playground where they were, or some were on the way home. And, it became much more seen, it felt to me that it was much more normal. It was much more common, and it wasn't something that was marginalised. It was something that actually Muslim women were experiencing in very, very public places. And so many, that one of the most striking things for me was that element of around the school, kind of taking kids to and from school. Because, of course, what happens then is that, those families don't want to leave their children at the school, because if the mums are becoming a victim of Islamophobia on the playground, the fear and the worry and the anxiety they have about leaving their kids there, suddenly becomes tenfold. So you can see it kind of like, it's almost like a ripple effect. You drop a stone and you can see it ripple out. So it's from the individual, it moves out through the family, through the friends, and then into the community as well. So it becomes much more kind of problematic. With male victims, there's been very little, kind of research done on male victims of Islamophobia. So that was one of the reasons I wanted to look at that. And, on the whole, most Muslim men don't visibly look as Muslim as a lot of Muslim women, and you can take a couple of assumptions. You can say, someone with a beard, or someone wearing kind of Islamic attire, and you go, okay, they look Muslim. But on the whole, somebody could be Asian, somebody could be Sikh, and one of the things that came through was actually sort of a lot of Sikh people were also experiencing anti-Muslim hate, because the kind of image in the media is that, you've got a beard and you wear a turban, you must be Muslim, and so there's an ignorance there as well in terms of them. But one of the things that was interesting was with the male victims was it much more centred around violence. And so the kind of verbal abuse that Muslim men received very much more focused on things such as go back to Iraq, go back to Afghanistan, go back to Syria. So where Britain and kind of like America were in some sort of military engagement, that was what we were seeing in there. So the abuse that Muslim men would get would much more relate to things such as, the war on terror, Increasingly towards the end of the research, it would be like, people would be called ISIS, you go back to Islamic State, these kind of things, this idea you don't belong, but all Muslims are the same, and don't, you're part of that violence though. The other thing that was really interesting as well, which kind of unfolded as I was doing the research, was, so we've seen these kind of child sexual exploitation kind of cases primarily in the north of the country, in north of England. Very much so, Muslim men were being accused of being
from Asian, Pakistani background.
Yeah, this is it.
Some of them are actually Sikh.
Yeah.
But this is being portrayed as Muslims.
Yeah.
And these were some evil sort of people who probably have no link to faith, but they're being portrayed as Muslims. And
this was the really interesting thing, because what I saw when I was looking at speaking to the male victims of Islamophobia was that, if you're a Muslim man, say in Birmingham, and somebody wants to direct hate at you, it could be that they're going to direct hate at you because of what some Muslims are doing in the Middle East, or they could be directing hate at you of what some Muslims or some Asians are doing in the north of England. But all the time, what was happening was that all Muslims were increasingly being seen to be the same. And you may well remember back in the 1970s, there used to be this kind of thing where racists used to say, all black people look the same. Well, I think that now it's going to, all Muslims are the same, and that was the way in which it was coming out. And then the final part was looking at the kind of physical structures and looking at the kind of the mosques and so on. And This was just something that we, really saw, and when I was looking just in the West Midlands, there was about 4 or 5 mosques where I went and visited and spoke to people there, and there'd been arson attacks on the mosques, so actual arson attacks, kind of like, trying to set fire to it. There was one mosque which actually sort of, had huge damage, and that was done on a Christmas day a few years ago. And so that idea, like for me is, sort of, being white British, but also being able to kind of move into kind of Muslim communities as well. The first thing when they told me that, I was like, that's a message. There's a message in there about Christian, like being Christmas Day, you're not a part of our Christmas Day, so. And so these kind of messages were always there. And that was the kind of thing that really came through for me, was the messages that underlie, the kind of hate. Yes, there was kind of violence, there was verbal abuse, there was physical abuse. Some were, some of the people I spoke to, experienced some really terrible kind of like physical, injuries. But it was about that message, and that really was what
you
what
mentioned
was
physical there, and earlier you spoke about Muslim women taking their children to school and feeling vulnerable, and sometimes thinking, I don't want to take my child to school because I might be attacked. And we had the lady in Leicester, actually, where you actually lecture, where as she was taking her children to school, she was run over deliberately, and then he reversed over, he turned around and ran her over again. Some horrific injuries. This sort of plays into that fear, doesn't it? Yeah.
Well, in the book, it's funny you saying that. And in the book, I actually talked to a white convert to Islam, and she was 8 months pregnant, and she had somebody was parked across her drive from her house, and she asked them to move the car, so she could put her car on. And the guy first off threatened to shoot her. And he said he would shoot a Muslim, so it was interesting that he didn't say, he could just call her Muslim. That was the only thing he could recognise her and identify her as. But then as she went behind the car, he also reversed the car into her and run her over, and she was 8 months pregnant. And so, these things are very real. They're very real, and they're very worrying. And that's why, there needs to be, we need to be able to raise awareness of this. We need to be able to kind of like, talk about these things openly, because this is what is actually going on.
As well as the victim-focused data, your new book reflects on your experience of working with government to address Islamophobia. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, so for the, probably for just over a decade now, I've been working or been consulted in a number of different ways, and I always work on an independent basis. Is with various different politicians, or with different kind of groups or kind of committees that have been set up, and one of those if I don't know if you probably remember, we go back to like kind of 2010, 2011, and Saida Varsi, she said that Islamophobia passed the dinner table test, and at that time I remember thinking, well, finally we're going to have we've got a government that's going to take this seriously. And you saw in the year afterwards that we set up the all-party parliamentary group on Islamophobia, we set up the anti-Muslim hatred working group, and I was invited to be an independent member of the working group. And one of the things that became clear, I was on there for 2 years, was that there was this idea that actually sort of from the sense that I got was that Muslims are a problem. That was the message I was picking up from government. Muslims are the problem, and you know what? When Muslims start behaving themselves, which is, this is I'm paraphrasing, when Muslims start behaving themselves and stop causing problems and stop causing trouble, actually then the Islamophobia will stop. So it was very much, I felt it was very much about focusing on Muslim communities and telling Muslim communities to change, to be more British. You probably remember David Cameron saying, Muslim communities in this country need to be more British. I mean, I'm British. I don't know whether I'm being more British or less British on a day-to-day basis, so I don't know what message that sends. But again, if you look at the kind of message that was being sent to Muslim men, you don't belong here, go back somewhere else. Actually, underlying that governmental message as well was this idea that Muslims don't belong. And until you start to belong more and become more British, which is, something which is impossible, Islamophobia will continue. And so I become very disillusioned with this. And we saw last year this move towards, this constant kind of decision by politicians to kind of say, well, we can't do anything about Islamophobia until we have a definition of it, and I remember I was first consulted on a definition of Islamophobia by government in 2009. It's now 2020. And, there's been so many definitions of Islamophobia put forward. My book in 2010 had a definition. The Runnymede Trust report in 1997 had a definition. The Runnymede Trust in 2017 offered a different definition. The All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims in 2019 offered a definition. We've got a lot of definitions out there. But every definition we put forward, the politicians say, well, it's not a good enough definition, so we can't do anything about it until we have a better definition. And I become more and more frustrated by this. And I've come to the conclusion that we don't need to have a firm definition. And this is why I was trying to bring these two issues together, because I can show you what Islamophobia is. I can show you in the most explicit ways that actually this is a very real and tangible thing. We don't need to be able to, define something that a Muslim woman walking along, a street in Birmingham experiences. We don't need to define that. Her experience tells us what Islamophobia is. And one of the things was that I come to the conclusion was that the politicians and the political spaces are increasingly prepared to kind of ignore the experience of ordinary Muslims going about their day-to-day life at the expense of coming up with a definition. And the longer that we go along with this, the longer we participate in this process of going, okay, let's find another definition, what we're doing is we're giving the government and we're giving the politicians the permission to actually do nothing. And that really was the key for me, was that, and again, this is where, this book is really necessary, because that's the position we're in at the moment.
You mentioned Sayyida Wasi, what she said about the dinner table discussion in 2009 or 2010, I can't remember. Yeah. But she recently, just I think it was a year or so ago, she said that her parents, when they came into this country many years ago, they used to say, or that generation used to say, oh, they're going to kick us out. They're going to kick us out. Yeah. And she used to laugh. Yeah. She became a solicitor, a lawyer. Yeah. She practiced law, and then she became a politician. Yeah. In the heart of the Tory Conservative Party. Yeah. And now she's saying that I feel fearful, of the future. Yeah. And those words that my parents used to say to me, they're coming back to me now. Yeah, and I can see that might not be something that's outrageous.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, so I've worked with Sayyida, over the past decade, and spoke to her on a number of occasions around this issue. I mean, one of the things, my politics are not the same as hers, but one of the things I've always found with her is that, like, whether you agree with her politics or not, actually she believed in what she was doing with these issues, and when she raised these issues in the public and political spaces, she did that with the very best of intentions, and her, what she has said since has actually been spot on. Every time she's called out the politicians and the Conservative Party for the problems that they have in there, she's been absolutely right to do so. I mean, it's interesting what you were saying there. When I was talking to people, there was kind of when I started talking to them about the impact of the hate, the kind of Islamophobia they experienced, there was two clear ways of doing it. There was those who were born in this country and saw themselves as being British, and maybe they had Pakistani or Bangladeshi heritage, which was a part of their journey, part of who they are. But they didn't really identify with that. I remember one. I remember one victim, one of the male victims. He was told to go back to Iraq, and when I was talking to him, he says, "I've never been out of the country." He says, he says, "I don't really want to either." And this is the reality. This is the reality of where we are. But there was this kind of thing that like suddenly, there was one of the women I spoke to. She said, I've always been British. She said, but now I've experienced this. She says, now I don't know whether I'll ever be British, or whether anyone will ever let me be British, And then she was like, and you get that kind of identity crisis, because she said, I'm not Bangladeshi and I'm not British, and, so who am I? And then what was interesting was there was others who said exactly the same as what you said there with Sayyida Wasi, was that I had a lot of people that were saying that, that young families were thinking, we need to have a contingency plan here, because at some stage we may need to go elsewhere, and that in itself, is I mean, it's really quite depressing. But again, it's about being able to raise that and talk about that and say, look, this is the reality of it. We can sit for 10 years trying to come up with a definition that we don't need. I mean, we don't have a fixed definition of racism, of homophobia, of disableism. Why do we need a fixed definition of Islamophobia? And this is the realities.
To a lot of people who interact with the radio station, they seem to think that it's because there's no will there to actually implement
and
this.
There's not. Yeah. I mean, that was absolutely. I mean, my experience was that you had politicians and you had ministerial departments that were paying lip service. You had a lot of Muslim organisations that were sitting at the table who were prepared to agree with the government, because they knew that there was funding and resources which were maybe available, and when I publicly resigned from one of the groups in 2014, and I said exactly that. I said the problem was that people weren't there for the issues; they were there to maintain their seat at the government's table.
I do remember that.
Yeah, it's difficult to be, because in some ways, you feel tired to kind of criticise publicly, organisations and certain individuals. And I've never individualised or named those organisations, but I do think that there is that case that actually we, when we have that place, when we are engaging with government, we should be holding them to account. We shouldn't be rubber stamping what they're doing, because a lot of these things have been hugely detrimental. And, as you say, there's the will to actually address this isn't there. The will just does not exist. It's about lip service.
We're talking to Dr. Chris Allen, Associate Professor at University of Leicester. He has a new book out titled Reconfiguring Islamophobia, a radical rethinking of a contested concept. The book tries to better understand why politicians and the public more generally still don't take Islamophobia seriously, despite the fact that Islamophobic hate crimes are known to be on the rise. So he's been reflecting on his own experience of working with successive governments. He also draws on the experience of more than 100 victims of street-level Islamophobia to come to some radical and quite scathing conclusions. Now, we're heading up to the end of the first part of the Friday Drive show. When we come back, we'll be asking him to talk about the conclusion and many other things. And we will join you after the ad break, and we'll be talking more, and we'll have another special guest joining us from Canada to talk about his experience of Islamophobia in Canada, and maybe his understanding or his perception of what he's felt since he's come into the UK. He's currently living in the UK. So we'll be back straight after this.